Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a rather bizarre, ancient biblical framework and translating it to help us make sense of our very modern struggles. We're going to unpack a wild story of survival, a poetic courtroom drama, and a really profound strategy of humiliation that, surprisingly, leads to preservation. Okay, let's just dive right into this by tapping into a deeply relatable, honestly exhausting modern feeling. Have you ever felt completely stuck in a hostile situation where you simply cannot escape? Maybe it's a toxic work environment, a totally unfair institutional structure, or just a life crisis where you feel like literally every move you make is being watched and weaponized against you. We really have to validate that anxiety because it's a profoundly human experience. That terrifying feeling that the world is run by chaotic systems and corrupt powers we just can't defeat on our own. It's entirely real. And the crazy thing is, centuries ago, a young King David felt this exact same way. He was completely crushed between two opposing powers, and his response gives us an absolute masterclass in navigating systemic pressure. So, let's look at the visible, earthly crises playing out here in David's life. To understand the severity of this crisis, imagine the total whiplash David is experiencing. Just a few years prior, he was anointed as the future king by the prophet Samuel. Just yesterday, he was a celebrated national hero. But today, he is fleeing for his life from the current king, Saul. Out of pure desperation, David grabs the sword of Goliath, which is this massive symbol of his past victory, and crosses a dangerous threshold into the Philistine city of Gath. He has literally gone from a hero carrying the sword of victory to a desperate fugitive trapped in hostile territory. So David is caught in a dual-layer crisis. Talk about being squeezed, right? On one side, you've got the internal threat, a failed, corrupted Israelite king, Saul, who actively wants him dead. And on the other side, you've got the external threat, the foreign enemy king, Achish of Gath, whose territory David just stumbled into. David is basically a man without a country, caught right in the middle of collapsing structures. And to make matters worse, his past success is actually his biggest liability right now. There was literally a popular pop song of the day that people sang about him, declaring David had slain tens of thousands of Philistines. Well, Saul's jealous rage back home and the Philistines' immediate alarm in Gath were both triggered by this exact same song. His own glowing reputation has essentially been turned into a deadly weapon against him. Now, what's really fascinating here is that to truly understand what's happening to David, we have to pull back the curtain. We can't just look at earthly politics. We have to look at the invisible, spiritual reality operating behind the scenes, which we can call the heavenly courtroom. Think of it as this unseen legal dynamic where spiritual forces operate according to God's cosmic governance. Every earthly crisis, every systemic oppression, and every miraculous deliverance actually has a legal parallel playing out in this heavenly court. What we see happening on earth is very often just a shadow of a legal proceeding happening in the unseen realm. So how does this courtroom actually operate for David in this moment? First, there's an unseen accusation. David is vulnerable because the covenant order in Israel is fractured by Saul's corruption. Second, God establishes a divine boundary. Similar to the story of Job, God allows David to be exposed to enemy jurisdiction to test him. But, and this is absolutely crucial, he sets a firm legal boundary that prohibits his ultimate destruction. And third, this results in an earthly verdict of preservation. Notice, God doesn't completely remove the pressure, right? He limits it. But man, that raises a really tough question about our own suffering, doesn't it? If God is in control and David is the anointed king, why doesn't God just send an army of angels to rescue David instantly? Why permit this terrifying exposure to danger in the first place? To find that answer, we've got to look at the climax of the story, where David executes a bizarre, shocking, but honestly brilliant legal strategy. Facing execution, David does the unthinkable. He doesn't try to look royal or brave or powerful. Instead, he sacrifices his dignity entirely. He behaves like a madman. He scratches meaninglessly at the doors, and he lets saliva run down his beard. Now, in the ancient Near East, that was the ultimate sign of a total loss of masculine honor and sanity. He makes an absolute public spectacle of himself. We can call this inverted theater. It's the act of surviving a hostile power by deliberately performing a disordered identity or pure foolishness. The future king survives by acting, well, utterly unkingly. The wise man survives by acting like a fool.
David performs this anti-royal disorder to survive, proving that God very often defeats earthly power through apparent humiliating weakness.
And here's why the location of this act is an absolute game changer. He does this at the city gate. In the ancient world, the city gate wasn't just an entrance. It was the courthouse. It was a legal boundary where official judgments were made. Because David performs this madness at the literal site of judgment, the enemy king, Achish, completely misreads the situation. He legally classifies David not as a military threat, but as a useless fool, and basically kicks him out. That misclassification is exactly what saves David's life. Which brings us directly to how David processes all of this later on in Psalm 56. This psalm is basically David's internal, theological interpretation of that deeply humiliating event in Gath. It's him processing what just happened behind the scenes. He writes these incredibly famous words. "You keep track of my misery. Put my tears in your leather container. Are they not recorded in your scroll?" David knows his suffering wasn't just random, wasted emotion. In the logic of that heavenly courtroom we talked about, his misery and his tears were actual legal testimony being submitted to the highest judge in the cosmos. This right here is a massive aha moment. Just look at the stark contrast between these two realities. While the earthly enemy at the gate only saw the meaningless scratches of a madman, God was actively recording David's meaningful tears in a heavenly scroll. On earth, he was perceived as mad. In heaven, his misery was validated. On earth, he was under enemy jurisdiction, but in heaven, he was safely wrapped up in divine jurisdiction. Because of this dual reality, Psalm 56 isn't telling us to just fake it and pretend we aren't afraid. David was terrified. Instead, it teaches us to redirect our completely valid fear of earthly, mortal systems into a fierce, unwavering trust in God's sovereign boundaries. Fear itself isn't the failure. Failing to redirect that fear to the ultimate judge, that's where we get into trouble. Let's tie this whole thing together by looking at how David's survival actually points to the ultimate cosmic victory. David's experience in Gath is actually this striking early shadow of Jesus Christ at the cross. Just think about the parallels for a second. Both were betrayed internally by their own people. Both were handed over to hostile Gentile foreign authorities. Both were publicly mocked, treated as fools, and viewed as false kings. David's survival shows us that the true anointed king establishes his kingdom not by avoiding humiliation, but by conquering right through the middle of it. So when David later writes in the psalm, "What can mere men do to me?" he isn't saying corrupt men can't harm his reputation or take his job or even hurt his physical body. I mean, they clearly can. What he's boldly declaring is that they absolutely cannot overrule God's heavenly verdict over his life. Their earthly jurisdiction is temporary. God's verdict is eternal. I want to leave you with this final, kind of provocative thought. How does knowing that God is carefully recording your tears in his heavenly scroll change your perspective on whatever pressure you're facing right now? When you feel totally trapped by the corrupt systems of this world, remember that your humiliation is not your destruction. Like David at the gate, it might just be the exact unconventional path God is using to perfectly preserve you.